a photograph that smiles when no one else does. What secret does it hide? Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Urvela. Share where you're listening from. I always treasure your comments. Now, let's begin. It was in the spring of 1891, during one of those rare interludes when London seemed momentarily free of scandalous crimes, that an affair of such peculiarity presented itself at our door in Baker Street. I confess that at first glance it appeared to me little more than a curiosity fit for a feuilleton in one of the illustrated magazines. Yet by the end, I would learn that beneath its seemingly whimsical surface lay a matter of the gravest import, involving blackmail, family honour, and most unsettling of all, the sinister manipulation of an image that by rights should have been incapable of change. The first intimation of the affair came in the form of a frantic rapping upon the door at an unusually early hour. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, angular gentleman of middle years, whose dishevelled cravat and trembling hands betrayed both haste and anxiety. His name, as he soon declared in a quavering voice, was Mr. Percival Denham, a barrister of the Inner Temple, known to Holmes by reputation as a man of some standing in legal circles. "Mr. Holmes," he cried, scarcely able to contain himself, "you must forgive the intrusion, but I am at my wit's end. A crime has been committed, or worse, an abomination, and Scotland Yard is powerless in the matter. I beg of you, sir, to lend me your aid." Holmes, who had been lounging in his dressing-gown, with the morning paper neglected upon his knee, sat upright at once, his keen grey eyes fastened upon the man with that peculiar intensity which so often made strangers feel they were already under examination. "Compose yourself, Mr. Denham," said he quietly. "Take a seat and tell us, if you please, in what manner a barrister of the King's Bench finds himself haunted by an abomination." The gentleman pressed a handkerchief to his brow and drew a deep breath. "It is the matter of a photograph, Mr. Holmes. A cabinet portrait of my late sister taken in Brighton some years ago. The likeness was unremarkable until last week, when, heaven help me, the expression upon the face altered. Where once she bore the faintest, most demure of smiles, the photograph now presents a grin, malicious, knowing, almost triumphant. And as if this horror were not enough, on the very night of that change, a colleague of mine was found dead in his chambers, under circumstances so strange that the police mutter of suicide, though I would stake my reputation that it is nothing of the kind." At this the gentleman faltered, and for a moment only the tick of the mantel clock disturbed the silence. Holmes's eyes had not left him. "A smiling photograph and a suspicious death," he murmured, steepling his fingers. "The two events occurred upon the same evening, you say?" "Yes, precisely so. Then pray proceed. Mr. Denham, spare us no detail, however trivial, for in the smallest fibre may lie the thread which guides us through the labyrinth." And thus began one of the most singular cases it has ever been my lot to record, wherein a mere alteration upon photographic paper led us into a tangled skein of deceit, and to one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of Holmes's deductive powers that I have ever witnessed. Would you like me to proceed with Section 2, Case Introduction, where Holmes begins probing Denham with his first razor-sharp deductions? Or would you prefer to linger a little longer in the hook and expand Denham's unsettling account of the photograph and the death? Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his long, delicate fingers pressed together in a gesture I had come to associate with his most concentrated efforts. The barrister's agitation seemed only to sharpen his focus, while I, for my part, could not help but feel a chill creep along my spine at the uncanny nature of the tale. A photograph whose very expression could alter was, to my medical mind, an impossibility bordering upon lunacy. Yet I had seen Holmes unravel mysteries no less strange, and I held my tongue, waiting for his lead. "You have told us, Mr. Denham," said Holmes at last, "that the expression upon the likeness of your late sister has altered. Pray, let us begin with the material fact. Where does this photograph now reside?" "In my study, at my chambers in King's Bench Walk," replied the barrister, clasping and unclasping his hands. "It lies in a leather case upon my desk. I assure you, Mr. Holmes, there can be no mistake. I have looked upon it countless times since her passing. It was a comfort to me in dark hours. The smile was once gentle, almost imperceptible, but now it shows a grin so ghastly that I scarce dare glance at it." Holmes's eyes glimmered. "And the alteration, did you observe it with your own eyes, or was it first remarked by another?" "I saw it myself, sir, on the very evening of the tragedy. I had returned late from supper, and seeking solace, opened the case. The sight that met me, God forgive me, it was as though the photograph mocked me. That same night, my colleague Mr. Arthur Fenwick was found lifeless in his chambers. The Yard insists upon suicide, for the door was locked from within, yet I am certain foul play was at work." "Fenwick," murmured Holmes. "A fellow barrister?" "Yes, we had chambers adjoining. A sound man, steady of mind and habit. He had no debts, no despairing temper. Suicide was wholly foreign to his nature." Holmes regarded him intently. "You suggest a connection between the two events. On what basis?" Denham hesitated, his lips trembling before the words emerged. "Because, sir, in Fenwick's hand, clutched even in death, was a folded scrap of paper. It bore but one line, written in his own hand. The photograph smiles because the truth is known." A shudder ran through me, and I confess I could not repress an exclamation of astonishment. Holmes, however, betrayed not the least surprise. He only leaned back, eyes half closed, and tapped his long forefinger against his knee. "A most singular message," said he softly. "Watson, do you mark how the phenomenon of the smiling portrait, bizarre though it appears, is here bound by testimony to a human agency? That line is our compass. Tell me, Mr. Denham, who besides yourself had access to your chambers and the photograph?" "No one," the barrister replied at once. Then, with a falter, "That is to say, Mrs. Hargreaves, my charwoman, comes twice weekly, but she is a woman of 60, most respectable and near illiterate. I cannot imagine her writing such a note, let alone contriving a crime." Holmes gave a slight smile. "We shall see. What of Fenwick? Did he know of the portrait?" Denham's brow furrowed. "Yes, indeed. He and I were close in confidence, and I once showed him the likeness of my sister, though I cannot fathom why it should be bound to his death." Holmes rose abruptly and began pacing the room, his dressing gown flaring at each turn. His head was bent, his gaze upon the carpet, yet I could see from the tautness of his movements that the case had gripped him. "Mr. Denham," said he, stopping short, "you have acted wisely in coming here. The Yard sees a locked room and calls it suicide. I see a message that cries out for interpretation. You spoke of your sister. Tell me, how long deceased?" "3 years, sir. She died of a fever contracted in Sussex. There was nothing untoward." "And her relations with Mr. Fenwick, did they ever meet?" Denham hesitated once more. "They were acquainted, yes. Indeed, some years ago, Mr. Fenwick paid her attentions of a gentlemanly nature, but she declined them. He bore the disappointment well, or so it seemed. Ah!" Holmes's eyes gleamed as he turned sharply on his heel. "A rejected suitor, a photograph preserved, a note that speaks of truth revealed. I think, Watson, we shall find in this affair something more than the whims of a camera plate." of a camera plate. He moved to the mantel and consulted his watch. "It is 8:30. If you are agreeable, Mr. Denham, Watson and I shall accompany you to King's Bench Walk within the hour. I should like to see this smiling photograph with my own eyes before Scotland Yard muddles the trail beyond recovery." Denham rose, visibly relieved. "You have given me hope, Mr. Holmes. I beg you, come at once." Holmes had already seized his coat and was fastening the buttons with practised precision. He cast me a look that needed no words. The adventure had begun, and he required my presence. Within minutes we were descending the familiar stairs, stepping out into the grey London morning. The fog clung low over the rooftops, muffling the clip of hooves and the rumble of wheels. As we hailed a hansom and set off toward the Temple, Holmes leaned close, his voice scarcely above a whisper. "Mark me well, Watson. We go not merely to examine a photograph, but to unravel the very fabric of a deception most artful. The dead man's message is no idle fancy. It is the fulcrum upon which this entire case must turn." And with that, he settled into silence, his hawk-like profile fixed upon the swirling mists ahead, while my own mind raced with questions, none of which found any ready answer. The cab rattled over the uneven stones, carrying us eastward through the murk of the morning. The damp fog pressed close, so that the lamps upon Fleet Street shone like blurred stars adrift in smoke. Denham sat stiffly opposite, his fingers worrying the rim of his hat, while Holmes remained absorbed in his own thoughts, his lips compressed in a line that I had learned to interpret as the prelude to sudden brilliance. I longed to question him, but long habit taught me that silence was best until his mind had worked its way to some conclusion. Thus we jolted along in uneasy quiet, until at last the cab drew up before the sombre archways of the Temple. Denham led the way across the courtyard and up a narrow stairwell to his chambers. The place bore the respectable austerity of the professional bachelor. Dark wainscoting, shelves of calf-bound law reports, and a few personal relics that hinted at a private life held in reserve. He went straight to a writing desk and, with trembling fingers, drew forth a small leather case, which he laid before Holmes as though it were a dangerous instrument. Holmes opened it without hesitation. I stepped nearer, eager and yet half dreading the sight. It was a simple cabinet portrait, the kind so common in studios of the day. A young lady seated, her hands folded demurely, her gaze fixed a little off to one side. At first glance it seemed no different from 1,000 others. Yet upon closer inspection there was indeed something strange. The lips, though faintly parted, bore the unmistakable trace of a grin that was out of keeping with the gentleness of the eyes, and which gave to the entire countenance an air of mocking triumph. Holmes studied it in silence for some time, holding it now near the window, now at arm's length, and once even upside down. He then drew a magnifying glass from his pocket and subjected the image to the most minute scrutiny. His keen features betrayed not excitement, but a growing serenity, as though each detail confirmed some inner expectation. "You see it, Watson?" he asked without lifting his gaze. "I confess," I replied, "that I see only a distortion most unnatural. How such a thing could have come about I cannot fathom." "Precisely," said he. "The human mind leaps at the supernatural when the natural suffices. But mark the lips. Do you note how the outline is ever so slightly blurred, in contrast to the sharper definition of the eyes and nose? That, my dear fellow, is no accident of exposure. We are looking at deliberate interference upon the surface of the print." "You mean," I exclaimed, that it has been altered, tampered with. Holmes closed the case with a snap. Most assuredly, it is the hand of man, not the whim of fate, that has given this lady her sinister smile. The question, therefore, is who had both the skill and the opportunity to effect such a change, and why it should coincide with the untimely death of Mr. Fenwick. At that moment, a knock sounded upon the outer door. Denham started violently, then opened it to admit Inspector Lestrade, his sharp features made sharper still by the morning chill. He greeted Holmes with the grudging respect born of many past encounters. "Ha! So you are on this business already, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Well, I suppose it was inevitable. For my part, I still call it a simple case of self-destruction. But since you are here, perhaps you will amuse yourself by proving me wrong." Holmes bowed slightly. "I should be delighted to be of service, Inspector. Pray, enlighten me. What particulars have you established regarding Mr. Fenwick's death?" Lestrade produced a notebook. Chambers locked from the inside, key still in the door. Body found upon the hearthrug, pistol at his side, powder marks upon the temple, consistent with a self-inflicted shot. No sign of disturbance or forced entry. In short, the textbook example of suicide. As for the note in his hand, it is a mere fragment of delirium, the sort of thing a man writes when his mind is unhinged. Holmes regarded him with a faint smile. "And yet, Inspector, would you not agree that the precision of the phrase, 'the photograph smiles because the truth is known,' suggests not delirium, but intention?" Lestrade shrugged. "Intention, perhaps, but intention to die. What else?" Holmes made no answer, but turned instead to Denham. "Mr. Denham, when you last saw Fenwick alive, how did he appear?" The barrister pressed a hand to his brow. "Troubled, I thought, but he gave no cause. We parted on friendly terms not 2 hours before. Then I returned to find the place surrounded by constables." Holmes's gaze softened. "I see. And this photograph, was it here, upon your desk at that time?" "Yes, I had shown it to Fenwick but a week earlier. He remarked upon my sister's likeness, and that was all." Holmes inclined his head, then, with a sudden movement, crossed to the adjoining wall. He laid his ear against the panelling, tapped it lightly with his knuckles, and then glanced at the floorboards. "Thin partitions," he observed. "It is quite possible for one in Fenwick's chambers to overhear conversation in yours. Did you speak of the portrait when last you conversed?" Denham hesitated, then nodded. "I did mention it, yes. I had remarked upon its strange alteration, though at that moment I thought myself merely overtired." He gave no reply beyond a sympathetic murmur. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Then, Watson, you perceive the sequence. A man rejects the easy path of life, yet leaves behind a message too coherent to be dismissed as ravings. He links his death to an altered image, the secret of which was within earshot. Inspector, you may call it suicide if you please, but to me it has all the savour of a carefully contrived illusion, an illusion behind which a very human hand conceals itself." Lestrade scowled, but said nothing. Holmes slipped the case into his pocket with the air of one who had already claimed it for study. "Come, Watson," said he. "There is more to be learned in Fenwick's chambers than in disputation. Mr. Denham, we shall return the portrait when we have satisfied ourselves of its mystery. In the meantime, you would do well to admit no one to these rooms without our sanction." And with that, he swept toward the door, his step brisk, his eyes alight, as though the fog without were but the veil of some grand design waiting to be pierced. I followed, my heart pounding with anticipation, for I knew that we stood upon the threshold of a riddle, whose answer might prove as deadly as it was ingenious. We crossed the passage into the chambers of Arthur Fenwick, where Lestrade's men had left everything much as they found it. The air was heavy with the acrid tang of discharged powder, mingling unpleasantly with the scent of old books and damp wool. The room itself was modest. An orderly desk with briefs neatly stacked, a narrow bed drawn up under the window, and the hearth where the body had lain, a dark stain still upon the rug as grim evidence of the tragedy. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his eyes flicking from corner to corner with that swift, hawk-like sweep which missed nothing. He advanced in silence, stooping here to brush a speck of ash with his fingertip, there to lift a stray thread from the carpet, each motion deliberate and precise. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, pointing toward the hearth. "The pistol lies near the right hand, yet Fenwick was left-handed. Note the ink stains upon the fingers of his left hand, consistent with a man who writes copiously. Is it not curious that he should employ his weaker hand to end his life?" "By Jove, Holmes, you are right," I exclaimed, recalling the countless times Fenwick's writings had been cited in legal circles. "Curious indeed," Holmes went on, crouching beside the rug. "And consider further, the powder burns are faint. The shot was not delivered at the closest range, as one might expect in suicide. The angle, too, is wrong. See how it entered the temple slightly from behind. A most awkward feat if self-inflicted. Yet the door was locked, the key still within. What conclusion is left to us?" Lestrade gave a grunt. "That someone shot him and managed to slip out, locking the door from the inside. A conjurer's trick, and hardly credible." "Hardly credible to the unimaginative," Holmes retorted. "But such stratagems exist. Recall the old trick of drawing the key out upon a strip of paper pushed beneath the door. It is simplicity itself for a determined hand. The true difficulty lies not in escaping, but in leaving behind a semblance of impossibility. That, Inspector, is the true art of this crime." He rose and crossed to the desk, upon which a few personal effects lay arranged with a neatness that spoke of Fenwick's character. A briefcase lay unlatched, revealing bundles of notes tied with ribbon. Among them Holmes drew out a smaller packet, secured with twine. He untied it and spread the contents. A series of photographs, all depicting young women of society, acquaintances perhaps, though none so remarkable as to warrant their careful preservation. Holmes examined each, then returned them without a word, his expression unreadable. From the drawer he drew a slip of paper, the very note clutched in the dead man's hand. He studied it long through his lens. "The writing is his own," he observed, "but the ink is fresher than the stains upon his fingers would suggest. He wrote this, it seems, not in the course of daily labour, but under some immediate compulsion. That line, 'The truth is known,' suggests revelation, a discovery perhaps forced upon him." Denham, who had followed us, uttered a low cry. "Then he knew something concerning the photograph?" Holmes replaced the note. "It is possible. Indeed, it is probable. The photograph is our fulcrum, but the chain is incomplete. Fenwick dies, leaving a riddle. The portrait smiles, transformed by deliberate hand. The one must explain the other. The key, I suspect, lies in the interval between the two events." He strode to the window and flung it open, peering down into the court below. "A long drop," he mused, "but the sill is dusted clean, as though recently wiped. Watson, do you perceive the faint smudge upon the stone? Someone leaned here recently, perhaps to observe, perhaps to signal. There is design, I assure you." At that instant a small figure shuffled into the chamber. Mrs. Hargreaves, the charwoman, her shawl pulled tight about her shoulders. She curtsied nervously under the combined gaze of the men. "Beg pardon, sirs," she said, "but I thought as how you might be wanting to know. There was a gentleman called here 2 nights ago, just after dark, tall with a soft voice. He asked for Mr. Fenwick, But when I told him master was out, he said he'd wait. He went into Mr. Denham's rooms instead, for I was scrubbing these floors." Holmes's eyes kindled. A tall gentleman with a soft voice. "Did you mark his appearance?" She shook her head. "Only that he wore a dark coat and carried a parcel under his arm. He stayed near an hour, then left. I saw no more of him." Holmes paced swiftly across the room. "The parcel! Yes, the parcel! Watson, do you not see? A photograph can be altered only with skill and materials. The intruder required both time and means. He had them here in Denham's absence. Thus the alteration was effected, and Fenwick, whether by sight or overhearing, divined the truth. His death followed at once. Denham's face had grown ashen. But who could desire to do such a thing? That, sir," Holmes answered gravely, "is what we must learn. The smiling photograph is no idle jest. It is a lever, perhaps of blackmail, perhaps of intimidation. We are in the presence of a mind that wields fear as its weapon." Lestrade shook his head. "A fanciful tale, Holmes. Still, I'll grant you it sits ill as suicide." Holmes snapped his notebook shut. "Come, Watson, we must follow the trail while it is yet warm. Our next step is clear. We must discover who visited these chambers bearing a parcel. The temple is no country lane. Every stranger is marked. I wager there is a clerk, a porter, or a watchman who saw more than they realize. Let us begin there." And so, leaving the chamber of death behind us, we descended into the fog-laden court, the silent photograph tucked in Holmes's pocket, its mocking grin seeming to follow us like a shadow. We found the temple courtyard, shrouded in the same ghostly vapour that had followed us from Baker Street, the lamps along the passages glowing like dull embers in the mist. Holmes wasted no time, but set about questioning the porters and clerks who lingered near the archway, men who seemed surprised to find themselves interrogated by so formidable a figure. The first knew nothing. The second, less timid, recalled a stranger passing late that evening. Tall and well-dressed, his features obscured by the brim of his hat. What marked him out, however, was the parcel he carried, wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine, which he kept close under his arm, as though it contained something of value. The clerk was certain of the time, a few minutes past 9. Holmes thanked him curtly, and drew me aside. "You note the precision, Watson. The hour fixes our man. Fenwick was seen alive at 10. Thus, within the span of 60 minutes, the photograph was altered, and the seeds of murder sown. The visitor is our hinge. All else turns upon him." We moved from the Temple into Fleet Street, Holmes striding swiftly, his gaze darting left and right, as though every signboard and shop front might yield its secret. He halted suddenly before a narrow establishment sandwiched between two larger houses. A photographic studio, its windows filled with carte de visite and portrait frames. Above the door, a painted sign bore the name Lemuel Graves, photographic artist. "Here, Watson," said Holmes, eyes alight. "Do you not perceive the congruity? A parcel, a photograph, an alteration. The coincidence is too striking." He entered without waiting for reply, and I followed into a dim interior redolent of chemicals, where glass negatives were stacked along the counter, and the proprietor, a gaunt man with hollowed cheeks, looked up from his work with startled eyes. Holmes wasted no courtesy. "Good day, Mr. Graves. I perceive from your stained cuffs and the traces of collodion upon your fingertips that you are no mere shopkeeper, but a craftsman of the darkroom. Tell me, did you by chance receive a visitor 2 nights past? A tall gentleman who required your skill in retouching a portrait?" The man's mouth fell open. "Why, sir, I did indeed. He came at a late hour, pressed a sovereign into my hand, and bade me alter a photograph. It was a lady's likeness, and he insisted the smile be exaggerated. I thought it odd, but the work itself was simple enough. When I asked his name, he gave none. He only said I was to complete it within the hour, which I did. He returned, paid me double, and left without further word. Holmes's eyes gleamed triumphantly. Excellent. And you have the plate still? Graves hesitated. I keep all my negatives, sir, though I do not often display such commissions. He disappeared into the back, returning with a glass plate which he handled with great care. Holmes examined it eagerly under the light. The features were unmistakable. Denham's sister, her lips grotesquely curved into that mocking grin. "Watson, the chain grows tighter," he whispered. "Here is proof of deliberate forgery, executed with professional skill at the behest of our mysterious visitor. The purpose is plain, to transform a gentle portrait into a symbol of menace. But why? For what end is this phantom smile employed?" Aloud, Holmes asked, "Mr. Graves, did the gentleman leave any token, any scrap of paper, any mark by which we might identify him?" The photographer shook his head, only that he spoke with a softness most unusual, like a man reluctant to let his true voice be heard. And he carried a walking stick, plain, yet worn at the ferrule as though from long use. Holmes inclined his head gravely. "You have been of inestimable service. Keep this matter to yourself, I beg, for lives may depend upon our silence." He pressed a coin into the man's hand and led me swiftly back into the fog. As we walked, he spoke in low tones. "Do you see the pattern, Watson? An altered photograph, timed with a death. A man of height, soft of voice, skilled enough to mask his identity. He strikes not with the pistol, but with suggestion, turning the most innocent image into a weapon of terror." Fenwick, perceiving the deceit, sought to resist, but the hand behind this business would not be gainsaid. Mark me, we deal with no common criminal, but a mind steeped in calculation. We had reached the Strand when Holmes abruptly hailed another cab. "Back to Baker Street, driver, with all speed! We must examine this portrait under proper conditions, and I must consult my index. There are but a handful of men in London who possess both the motive and the cunning for so perverse a stratagem. I have one name already upon my lips, but I would not speak it aloud until certainty crowns the deduction." I pressed him for more, but he only closed his eyes, his features set in that expression of austere patience I had come to know too well. The wheels clattered on the stones, and I sat in silence beside him, the weight of the smiling photograph seeming to press upon us both, as though its twisted grin mocked not only the dead man, but our very pursuit of truth. The cab drew up at Baker Street, and Holmes, without pausing to remove his coat, strode directly to the table where his chemical apparatus stood arranged with military precision. He drew the altered photograph from his pocket, set it carefully under a strong lamp, and began an examination so thorough that I could almost hear the cogs of his mind turning. His magnifying lens flicked across the surface. Then a fine needle traced the faintest ridges of the paper. He muttered to himself, words half-formed, then threw open a drawer and produced a series of small bottles and powders. Within minutes he had the portrait bathed in a thin solution, its surface shimmering under the light like a living thing. "Watson," he said, "observe how the emulsion about the mouth is of fresher texture than the rest. The hand of Mr. Graves was swift and skilful, but not perfect. In altering the smile, he unwittingly left a residue that betrays the artifice. To Fenwick, who knew the original intimately, the fraud must have been plain. He understood in that instant that the photograph had become not a keepsake, but a weapon. That knowledge, Watson, sealed his fate. I bent closer, the truth dawning upon me. Then the photograph was intended to convey a message, to strike fear into the heart of Mr. Denham, or perhaps others connected with the lady. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Exactly. We have here no idle whim, but a calculated signal. Who receives such a message? Who trembles at a smile twisted to mockery? The answer lies in Denham's family history. He crossed swiftly to the corner where his great index of cases stood. A vast accumulation of scrapbooks, notes and cuttings, arranged with meticulous care. Running a finger down a column, he pulled forth a volume and opened it upon the desk. Here we are. The Denhams of Sussex, landed gentry of no small repute. 3 years ago, a scandal whispered through legal circles, though hushed with equal speed. Percival Denham's sister, our unfortunate subject, was rumoured to have been courted not only by Fenwick, but by one Gerald Markham, a man of ill regard, whose dealings skirted the edges of law and honour alike. When she refused him, he vanished from society, his name blackened by debts and whispered threats. Yet I note here, Watson, that he was known for his peculiar voice, low and soft, as though muffled by habit or deformity. I started. The very description given by Graves. Holmes snapped the book shut with a decisive gesture. Precisely. Gerald Markham has reappeared in our midst. He alters the likeness of the woman who spurned him, transforming her gentle smile into a sneer, and places it where Fenwick might see. The message is plain. The dead shall mock the living. Fenwick, whether from loyalty or guilt, understood the meaning and sought to resist, but Markham silenced him forever. The locked room, a trifling matter to a man of resource. At that instant, a hurried knock rattled the door, and Mrs. Hudson admitted a boy in the livery of a telegraph messenger. He handed Holmes a folded slip, then vanished as quickly as he had come. Holmes tore it open and scanned the contents. A slow smile curved his lips. Watson, the game advances apace. The message is from Lestrade, who, despite his scepticism, has been stirred to action. He reports that a figure answering to our description was seen entering lodgings in Bloomsbury only yesterday. A tall man, soft of voice, carrying a walking stick. The name upon the lease, Gerald Markham. Holmes seized his hat and cloak. There, my dear fellow, is the coil of the serpent. If we strike swiftly, we may yet grasp him before he weaves his web tighter. Come, Watson. This night's work may decide the fate not only of justice, but of the honour of an innocent family. We descended once more to the waiting street, the fog swirling thick as wool, and hailed a cab bound for Bloomsbury. As the horse clattered forward, Holmes leaned toward me, his voice low and urgent. Remember, Watson, we are dealing with a man whose weapon is not brute force, but suggestion, whose art lies in turning what is harmless into horror. We must tread carefully, for if he senses our pursuit, he may loose yet another phantom smile to mask his deeds. I gripped my cane, my pulse quickening. The photograph, its grin burned into my memory, seemed to travel with us through the gloom, a silent spectre urging us onward to the very heart of the mystery. The cab bore us swiftly to Bloomsbury, where the fog hung heavy between the tall sooty facades, muffling the sound of wheels and lending each gas lamp the appearance of a wavering lantern. Holmes directed the driver to a narrow street lined with lodging-houses of respectable but modest appearance. At one of these he bade the cab halt. It was a tall, narrow building with polished steps and a brass plate beside the door. The letters upon it faintly discernible through the mist. Chamberlain's Private Lodgings. Holmes alighted, his figure a mere shadow against the gloom, and I followed, my heart thrumming with anticipation. Inside, a thin woman of uncertain age received us with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Holmes introduced himself with a gravity that brooked no resistance, and asked if a Mr. Gerald Markham resided under her roof. She admitted at once that such a gentleman had indeed taken rooms on the upper floor not 3 days earlier. He kept odd hours, she said, often slipping out after dusk and returning well past midnight. He spoke little, paid in ready coin, and carried always a stout walking stick. Holmes inquired whether he was at home at present. The woman shook her head. He had gone out at twilight and had not yet returned. With that, Holmes pressed a sovereign into her palm and requested the use of the sitting-room until the gentleman's return. She acquiesced readily, and we were shown into a modest chamber, where a coal fire burned low and the faint tick of a clock filled the silence. Holmes took up a station by the window, peering through the curtain at the street below, his lean figure tense with watchfulness. I sat opposite, scarcely daring to break the silence. Minutes stretched into an hour, the fog outside thickening until even the nearest lamp was no more than a hazy blot of light. At length the sound of measured footsteps echoed along the pavement. Holmes raised a hand for silence. Through the curtain I discerned a tall figure advancing slowly. The man's gait was deliberate, his shoulders broad beneath a dark overcoat, and in his hand he carried the unmistakable outline of a stick. He paused at the door, cast a glance up and down the street, then entered. We heard his tread upon the stairs. Holmes's eyes glittered. He moved noiselessly to the door and pressed his ear against it. The steps ascended past us to the upper floor, then halted. A key turned in a lock, and the faint creak of hinges followed. Holmes straightened, his decision made. "Watson, the bird is in its nest. Now we must see if it sings." He opened the door with the lightest touch, and together we stole up the narrow stair. A dim glow shone beneath the door at the landing. Holmes motioned for silence, then with sudden firmness rapped upon the panel. There was a moment's pause, then a voice from within. A soft, curiously muffled voice that matched our expectations. "Who is there?" "Friends who desire but a moment of your time." Holmes returned smoothly. The lock clicked, and the door opened a hand's breadth. A pair of eyes peered out, sharp and suspicious. Then the door swung wider, revealing a man of striking height, with pale features and lips that barely moved as he spoke. The room behind him was sparse, furnished only with a table upon which lay scattered papers, a lamp, and what appeared to be a small photographic apparatus. Holmes entered without waiting for invitation, his presence commanding, and I followed at his side. The man closed the door behind us with a slow, deliberate motion, his gaze fixed upon Holmes with something between curiosity and defiance. "You are Gerald Markham," Holmes said quietly. It was not a question. The man inclined his head, his lips curling in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "And you, I presume, are Sherlock Holmes. I wondered how long it would take you to find me." The air in the room grew charged with unspoken tension. Holmes's eyes darted to the photographic equipment upon the table, then to the sheaf of papers at Markham's elbow. "You have been busy," he said, his tone almost conversational, altering faces, twisting smiles, turning memory into mockery. A curious occupation for a man once welcomed in society. Markham's expression hardened. "Society turned its back on me. I but return the courtesy." Holmes stepped closer, his voice cutting through the room like steel. "And Fenwick? Did he too turn his back on you? Or did he merely stumble upon the truth of your handiwork? The smile upon that photograph was your message, but Fenwick read it too clearly. His death, then, was the price of his insight?" For the first time Markham's composure faltered. His fingers tightened upon the head of his stick, and his eyes flickered toward the table, where a small revolver lay half-concealed beneath the papers. Holmes's gaze followed instantly, his posture shifting ever so slightly, and I realized the peril of our position. "Careful, Watson," Holmes murmured. "The man is cornered, and a cornered man may strike." Markham's lips curved again, but this time the smile was no less sinister than the one he had conjured upon the photograph. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes, but cleverness will not save you if you press me too far." The room seemed to throb with silence, the firelight casting wavering shadows across the walls. My hand tightened upon my cane, every nerve braced for what might come. Holmes stood unmoving, his grey eyes locked upon the man before him, as though the outcome of the entire affair balanced upon that single, breathless moment. Holmes did not stir, though I could see the tension ripple through his frame. His voice, when it came, was quiet, measured, and utterly devoid of fear. "You mistake the position, Markham. It is not we who are cornered, but you. Scotland Yard is already upon your scent. At this moment Lestrade has men posted at the street below. One cry from me, and you will find the noose closing round your neck." Markham's eyes narrowed, but he did not immediately move. Instead, he leaned upon his stick, his lips twitching as though he weighed some private calculation. "And yet," he said at last, that muffled voice soft as ever, "the law requires proof, Mr. Holmes. Proof beyond conjecture. You have nothing that binds me to Fenwick's death, nothing that shows I laid hand upon him. You have only whispers and a smile upon a photograph. Hardly enough to hang a man." Holmes's expression did not change, but his eyes gleamed with a light I knew well. "On the contrary," he said, "I have precisely what is needed, the testimony of a photographic artist who altered the portrait at your command, the charwoman who saw you wait in Denham's chambers, parcel in hand, the clerk who marked your entry to the Temple at 9 o'clock. And here—" He reached suddenly for the table, plucking a sheet from the untidy pile. "Here is the final link. Your own hand, Markham, in notes and sketches of alterations. The very method by which you contrived the smile." Markham's composure broke. His hand darted toward the revolver hidden beneath the papers, but Holmes had anticipated the move. In a flash his long arm swept forward, striking the weapon to the floor. It clattered against the boards, and I sprang forward, my cane raised. Markham recoiled, his face pale, his breath quickened, yet his eyes glimmered with a strange defiance. "You are clever indeed, Holmes," he hissed, "but you do not comprehend. The smile was no mere trick of spite. It was justice. She betrayed me, mocked me, ruined me. Her family cast me out as though I were filth. I swore that her face would one day sneer at them all, and so it has." His words chilled me, for in that moment the man's obsession lay bare. A mind consumed by vengeance, using memory itself as a weapon. Yet Holmes only regarded him with cool detachment. "A pitiable delusion," he said. "But justice is not served by twisting the dead into accomplices, nor by silencing the living who perceive the truth. You sought to turn grief into terror, to make a family tremble at a phantom grin. That, Markham, is your crime as much as the bullet that struck Fenwick down." The sound of hurried steps upon the stair cut short his reply. A knock rattled the door, and Lestrade entered with 2 constables close behind. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. The pale figure of Markham, the scattered apparatus, Holmes standing firm beside the table. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "I see you have the fellow fast. We heard your signal on the stair." Holmes gestured coolly. "Inspector, I present Gerald Markham, the author of both a forgery and a murder. You will find in his papers ample evidence of his design. I caution you, he is desperate, though the fight seems drained from him now." Markham gave a bitter laugh, but offered no resistance as the constables stepped forward and seized his arms. His stick fell clattering to the floor, its ferrule worn to the wood, the symbol of a man who had walked long in darkness. As they led him out, his voice floated back, soft and mocking. "The smile remains, Holmes. You cannot unmake it. It will haunt them still." The door closed, and silence descended. Holmes stooped, retrieved the revolver, and placed it carefully upon the table. His gaze lingered for a long moment upon the distorted portrait that lay beside it. Then, with a sigh, he slipped it back into its case. "Watson," he said, "there are wounds of the spirit more enduring than those of the flesh. A smile once twisted may long outlast the hand that forged it. Yet the law will have its due, and perhaps with time the family may recover their peace." I could not answer, for my mind was filled with the image of that cruel grin, lingering still like a shadow upon the room, even as the man who had conjured it was carried away to his fate. When the tramp of boots had faded down the stair, and the door fell shut behind them, Holmes sank into the nearest chair, folding his long fingers beneath his chin. The firelight played upon his sharp features, casting them into planes of shadow and brilliance, and I saw that, though triumphant, he was not wholly satisfied. His gaze lingered upon the closed case that held the disfigured portrait, and his eyes grew distant, as though the mystery yet withheld some final secret. "You are not content, Holmes," I ventured at last. "The man is taken, the evidence overwhelming. What remains unsettled?" Holmes drew a slow breath, his voice measured and grave. "Justice has laid its hand upon Markham, Watson, yet the fabric of the case is not quite whole. There is the question of motive, which he proclaimed readily enough. Vengeance for a slight, bitterness nurtured into obsession. But there is also the matter of method. Consider. He altered the portrait with the aid of a professional, then contrived Fenwick's death as if by his own hand. Yet why Fenwick? Why not Denham himself, the brother of the woman he despised? The query startled me. Surely Fenwick stumbled upon the secret and had to be silenced. True, but chance alone is seldom the architect of crime. I perceived design even in Markham's seeming frenzy. Fenwick was the suitor once refused, the rival cast aside. By striking him down, Markham removed the one man whose knowledge might have countered his own tale. Imagine, Watson, had this affair not been brought to light. Denham, finding the portrait transformed and learning of Fenwick's supposed suicide, might have been driven to despair, perhaps to ruin. A double vengeance, precise and cruel. The reasoning chilled me, and for a moment we sat in silence, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire. At length I asked, "And the locked chamber? You spoke of stratagems, but did you truly discern how it was managed?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. A simple device, though clever in its execution. A length of gut or cord passed through the key, drawn beneath the door upon a slip of paper, allows the bolt to turn from without. The pistol placed near the hand, and the angle of the wound contrived with the aid of surprise. Fenwick never suspected his visitor of bearing mortal intent. The illusion was complete, save for those small inconsistencies which no artifice can wholly conceal. I could not withhold my admiration. "You make it sound as inevitable as the solving of an equation. He inclined his head, though his expression remained sombre. "Yet behind each equation, Watson, stands a human soul, twisted or broken. I take no joy in the ruin of such men as Markham. only in the triumph of reason over deceit. He rose then, slipping the photograph into his pocket, and motioned for me to follow. Come, it grows late. We must return to Baker Street. There remains the matter of Denham's peace of mind, and I would spare him the torment of that infernal grin. The cab bore us back through the veiled streets, the fog parting in languid swirls before the lamps. When at last we reached our familiar rooms, Holmes set the portrait upon the table and regarded it with cool detachment. This likeness, Watson, is no longer a keepsake but a weapon. We must ensure it harms no more. Tomorrow it shall be restored to its rightful state, or destroyed if Denham so wishes. A memory once corrupted can become more dangerous than a blade. He turned then to the violin, cradling it beneath his chin. The first low notes filled the room, solemn and reflective, as though he sought to weave order once more from the chaos of human passion. I sat back in my chair, the case still vivid in my mind, and watched him draw the bow with that peculiar grace which seemed to calm his restless spirit. And though the photograph lay silent upon the table, its smile sealed within the leather case, I could not shake the sense that it lingered yet, an echo of menace beneath the music, waiting for Holmes's final word to banish it to memory. The following morning dawned bleak and colourless, the fog of the previous night having settled into a damp drizzle that blurred the outlines of the city. I found Holmes already at the table, the offending photograph propped against a jar of tobacco, his gaze fixed upon it with that peculiar intensity which seemed to pierce through matter itself. He greeted me with a curt nod, his mind plainly absorbed in some inward debate. "Watson," said he at last, "I have resolved that the portrait must be restored, not destroyed. Memory is a fragile vessel. Once shattered, it cannot be remade. To obliterate her likeness would be to yield victory to Markham's malice. Instead, we shall return her face to the serenity it once bore. Denham shall look upon his sister again, not upon the mockery that villain contrived." I assented readily, for I too recoiled from the thought of consigning so personal a relic to the fire. Holmes, however, had already dispatched a note to Mr. Graves, instructing him to call at Baker Street. In less than an hour, the gaunt photographer was shown in, his hat clutched nervously in his hand. Holmes laid the case before him with quiet authority. "You have the skill, Mr. Graves, to undo the harm you were compelled to commit. The gentleman who paid you is now in custody. Will you restore this image to its original state?" The man's hollow cheeks flushed. "Gladly, sir. I swear to you, I meant no ill by it. A commission is a commission, and I ask no questions." But the look of that smile haunted me. "It will be as it was, you have my word." Holmes inclined his head. "See that it is so, and you will have done your part in righting a grave wrong." When Graves had departed with the photograph, Holmes leaned back, folding his hands. Thus the last vestige of Markham's cruelty shall be effaced. Yet mark this, Watson. Though the image may be cleansed, the memory of its corruption will linger. That is ever the way with fear. It leaves shadows long after the light has returned. Toward noon, Percival Denham himself arrived, pale and drawn, but with a spark of relief in his eyes. Holmes received him kindly, and related the progress of events with his usual economy, detailing how Markham had altered the photograph, contrived Fenwick's death, and sought to cloak both beneath a veil of impossibility. Denham listened with parted lips, his hands trembling upon the arms of the chair. "To think," he murmured, "that such malice should have taken root in a man once welcomed at our hearth. My poor sister! How she would have shuddered to see her likeness so profaned!" Holmes regarded him keenly. "Take comfort, sir. The profanation was but temporary. The likeness shall be restored, and Markham will answer for his deeds. Your sister's memory shall remain unsullied, save for the stain which time will surely wash away." Denham pressed Holmes's hand fervently. "You have given me back more than I can express, not merely justice, but the dignity of remembrance. I owe you a debt beyond words." When at last he had departed, Holmes lit his pipe and stood long at the window, the drizzle tracing crooked paths upon the glass. His figure was outlined against the grey street, his shoulders slightly stooped, as though bearing a weight invisible to others. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "the law may seize the criminal, but it is reason that rescues the soul. Had the smile endured, Denham would have been haunted all his days. By restoring the image, we restore balance. Yet we must never forget that it is not the photograph which smiles or sneers, but the mind that bends it so. There lies the true battleground." He turned then, his keen eyes softened by a rare gentleness, and I felt again the profound respect that bound me to him in all our adventures. The fire crackled, the smoke curled in lazy wreaths about his head, and the storm outside abated into a thin mist. Thus closed the curious affair of the photograph that smiled back, a case as chilling in its conception as in its execution, and one that revealed once more the power of my friend's unparalleled mind to pierce the veil of mystery and restore order where all seemed lost. For some days afterward, the case seemed concluded, and life at Baker Street resumed its accustomed rhythm. Holmes returned to his chemical experiments with renewed vigour, while I attended to my practice, though my thoughts often wandered back to the sinister grin that had so nearly shattered a family's peace. Yet I could not shake a faint unease, as though some thread remained untied. Holmes himself, though outwardly tranquil, betrayed by small signs that his mind still revolved upon the matter. He would sit long in silence, the smoke from his pipe wreathing upward, or pluck absently at the strings of his violin, pausing mid-phrase with a frown that spoke of unfinished calculation. It was on the 5th evening that our quiet was disturbed by another knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, whose manner was unusually grave. He laid his hat upon the table and turned at once to Holmes. "We have a complication, Mr. Holmes. Markham refuses to speak. He admits the alteration of the photograph, but of Fenwick's death he declares himself innocent. He insists he never set foot in the man's chambers on the night in question. The evidence is strong, but the law demands certainty, and the Crown may hesitate without confession or a direct witness." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Confession is the last resort of the unimaginative, Inspector. We must instead compel the truth to declare itself. Markham is a cunning adversary. He seeks to sever the chain at its weakest link. Our task is to bind it tighter. Tell me, what of his belongings? Did you search them?" Lestrade produced a small packet of papers. "We found sketches of faces, notes on photographic processes, and this." He unfolded a slip on which were scrawled several names, among them Percival Denham and Arthur Fenwick, with curious marks beside each. Holmes's eye fastened upon it instantly. "A list of targets," he murmured. "See, Watson, how the names are paired with symbols. An X, a dash, a star. Fenwick bears a cross, Denham a circle. A system of intent, perhaps a catalogue of vengeance. This, Inspector, is as damning as any confession, for it shows design. Fenwick was marked for death long before the night of his murder." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "It may serve, though a clever counsel will call it cryptic." Holmes rose and began to pace. "Then we must go further. Markham's voice, his manner, his very movements betray him. Did the charwoman not describe his presence in Denham's chambers? Did not the photographer Graves see his face, however briefly? We must bring them together, set them in his presence, and observe. The human memory, Inspector, may err in detail, but it seldom falters in essence. A recognition once struck cannot be gainsaid. Lestrade nodded slowly. Very well, we shall arrange it. After he had departed, Holmes turned to me with that gleam I knew too well. You perceive, Watson, that the case is not yet complete. Until the law binds him, Markham remains a danger. He is a man who thrives on suggestion, on shadows and whispers. If he escapes through some quibble, he will strike again, and the next smile may be more dreadful than the first. We must therefore tighten the net, so that even his cunning cannot slip free. I could not but agree, and as the fire burned low, I felt once more the weight of the pursuit pressing upon us, the sense that the true end lay not in discovery alone, but in the relentless securing of justice. Holmes resumed his seat, his eyes shining with resolve, and I knew that the coming days would bring fresh turns in this singular affair. 2 days later, the test Holmes had devised was set in motion. Lestrade summoned us to Scotland Yard, where Markham was held under strict watch. The man sat in a stark chamber, his wrists manacled, his pale features composed yet strained, as though his mind laboured ceaselessly for some avenue of escape. He greeted Holmes with a faint curve of the lips, that same half-smile which seemed to mock every word spoken to him. Holmes gave him no more than a passing glance before turning to Lestrade. "Bring in the witnesses, if you please." First entered Mrs. Hargreaves, the charwoman, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. She looked timidly at the prisoner, then gave a little cry and clutched at her skirts. "That's him, sir. The very gentleman who came with the parcel. I'd swear it before any judge." Markham's expression did not alter, but his eyes flickered, betraying the first crack in his composure. Next came Graves, the photographer. He hesitated only a moment before pointing squarely at the prisoner. The same height, the same face. I know those eyes. He is the one who brought me the portrait to alter. Holmes observed the exchange with quiet satisfaction, then addressed Markham directly. "You hear, sir? These are not whispers, not conjecture, but witnesses who saw you with their own eyes. Will you still maintain that you never touched Denham's chambers, never set foot in Fenwick's rooms?" For the first time Markham's lips moved with visible effort, as though speech cost him dearly. "They mistake me," he said, his voice still soft but quivering with strain. "Faces are easily confused in the fog of London. You have nothing but the word of servants and tradesmen. I tell you, I was elsewhere." Holmes's reply was sharp as a blade. "Elsewhere, yet with the list of names in your own hand. Elsewhere, yet carrying the very walking stick described by both. Elsewhere, yet with the means and skill to twist a photograph into a message of fear. Do not insult our intelligence, Markham. You may cloak your deeds in silence, but silence itself can condemn." Markham's gaze met Holmes for a long moment. The two men locked as in combat, one defending with obstinate denial, the other pressing with relentless reason. At last the prisoner's eyes dropped and his shoulders sagged. He made no further protest, but neither did he confess. Lestrade, satisfied, declared the evidence sufficient for the magistrate, and the witnesses were dismissed. As we left the yard, Holmes's manner was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "You perceive, Watson, that he will not yield openly. His pride is his last fortress, yet the wall is breached. The law will do the rest. Still, I cannot help but reflect on the ingenuity of his cruelty. To twist a smile into a sneer, to turn a memory into a weapon, Such is the art of terror. It is fortunate indeed that reason has prevailed, else we might even now be chasing shadows. The damp wind swept along Whitehall as we emerged, carrying with it the clamour of the city. Yet to me it seemed that the faintest echo of that unnatural grin lingered still. Holmes, however, walked with brisk purpose, his gaze fixed ahead, as though already turning his mind from shadows to the next problem waiting in the endless labyrinth of London. That evening found us once more before the fire at Baker Street, the case apparently in its final stages, yet Holmes showed none of the complacency that so often follows a victory. He sat in his armchair, the tips of his fingers pressed together, his gaze lost in the shifting glow of the coals. I ventured to congratulate him on the capture of Markham and the certainty of conviction. But he only shook his head slowly, as though my words had brushed against some hidden current of thought. "You speak of certainty, Watson," he said at length, "but certainty is the rarest of commodities. The law will proceed, the evidence will suffice, and Markham will, in all probability, meet his fate. Yet the true student of crime cannot rest content with probability alone. There is a discordant note still sounding in this affair, faint but insistent." I leaned forward, startled. "You doubt his guilt?" "Not his guilt," Holmes replied firmly, "but the completeness of our understanding. Consider. Fenwick left behind that peculiar note. The photograph smiles because the truth is known. Markham may have contrived the alteration and brought terror into Denham's chambers, but the phrasing suggests more than mere recognition of forgery. It hints at a secret uncovered, something larger than a twisted portrait." His eyes flashed suddenly, and he rose to pace the room. Fenwick was a lawyer of acute mind, privy to many confidences. What if, in that final hour, he perceived not only the alteration, but the motive it masked? Markham's vendetta may not have been confined to vengeance alone. There may have been some hidden gain, some inheritance, some legal entanglement in which Denham's family played a part. Fenwick's silence would have been dangerous, hence his removal. I protested that no mention had been made of such entanglements, but Holmes only smiled thinly. The absence of evidence is often the loudest evidence of all. We must look beyond the surface. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall pay another visit to King's Bench Walk. I would examine Fenwick's papers with closer care. There may lie the missing cord. True to his word, we presented ourselves at the chambers the next morning, Lestrade having provided access. Holmes set about the task with relentless energy, rifling through briefs, ledgers, and correspondence. For nearly an hour, nothing emerged but the dry routine of legal practice. Then, with a cry of satisfaction, Holmes drew forth a folded sheaf from the bottom of a drawer. It was sealed but not addressed, and upon breaking it open, we discovered a draft of a will, unsigned yet unmistakably prepared by Fenwick. Holmes spread the document across the desk, his eyes scanning swiftly. As I suspected, this concerns an estate in Sussex belonging to the Denham family. Note here, if Percival Denham were to die without issue, a portion would fall not to his sister's line, but to a certain Gerald Markham, a distant cousin through the mother's side. Fenwick, in drafting this, would have known of the connection. Perhaps he spoke too freely, or perhaps Markham contrived to learn of it. In either case, the altered photograph was but the mask. The true prize lay in inheritance. The revelation struck me with force, explaining at last the ferocity of Markham's campaign. Not content with vengeance, he sought wealth and position, his crime both personal and pecuniary. Holmes folded the paper carefully. "There, Watson, lies the missing cord. Now the note Fenwick penned makes perfect sense. The smile upon the photograph was not only mockery, but the sign of a truth unveiled, the truth of Markham's hidden claim. He died for knowing too much. Holmes's face softened as he replaced the document. It is always thus. Beneath the grotesque mask of crime lies the same eternal motive: ambition, greed, vengeance. The photograph was but the stage dressing. The drama, as ever, was human passion. We left the chambers in silence, the drizzle pattering softly upon the stones, while Holmes strode at my side with the air of a man whose mind, at last, had reached its resolution. Holmes's discovery weighed heavily upon us both as we made our way back through the damp streets. He was silent, lost in thought, while I pondered the cruel ingenuity of Markham's design. That he had twisted grief into terror was monstrous enough, but to cloak an inheritance scheme beneath the ghastly mockery of a smile seemed the very height of depravity. When at last we returned to Baker Street, Holmes laid the draft will upon the table with a kind of reverence, as though it were the keystone of an arch that had at last revealed its form. "Watson," he said, pacing before the hearth, "consider how neatly the elements fit. A man cast out from society, burning with vengeance, suddenly perceives that the very family he despises holds also the key to his fortune. He seizes upon the photograph, not only to wound Denham's heart, but to mask his deeper play. Fenwick, privy to the legal tie, perceives the truth and must be silenced. Thus the locked chamber, the note, the false smile, all contrived to draw suspicion into the realm of the bizarre, while the true motive remained hidden beneath layers of suggestion. I marvelled at the audacity of it, and had Fenwick not left that cryptic message, might it not have succeeded? Holmes inclined his head. Quite possibly. The supernatural explanation, once admitted, blinds the eye to reason. Without Fenwick's dying hint, we might have been left chasing phantoms, while Markham bided his time until opportunity allowed him to press his claim. It was the man's arrogance, Watson, his need to taunt even in triumph, that proved his undoing. He seated himself then, his fingers steepled, his eyes half closed. Yet there remains a delicate duty. Percival Denham must be informed of this hidden clause. Though Markham's designs are thwarted, the knowledge itself may trouble him deeply. The memory of his sister is already marred by this affair. Shall we add to it the stain of a cousin's greed? Still, truth is the only safeguard against future harm. We must deliver it with care. Deliver it with care. Deliver it. That afternoon Denham arrived in answer to Holmes's summons. He entered with visible apprehension, his frame thinner, his hair more dishevelled than when first we met. Holmes greeted him gravely, and after a pause, placed the draft will before him. Denham read in silence, his face paling as the implication grew clear. At last he looked up, stricken. So Markham's interest was not only vengeance, but fortune. He would have profited by my death. Precisely so, Holmes replied. It is a cruel revelation, but one you must hold in mind. The courts will hear it, and the matter will be put beyond his grasp. No further claim can be advanced once the draft is laid before them. Take comfort, Mr. Denham, that his malice has been exposed in full, and that neither your honour nor your estate shall fall to him. Denham pressed his brow with trembling fingers. It is bitter comfort, yet comfort none the less. I thank you, Mr. Holmes, more than words can say. You have saved not only my life and livelihood, but the dignity of my sister's memory. When he had gone, Holmes stood long at the window, watching the drizzle blur the outlines of the city. His profile was austere, the smoke of his pipe curling about him like a veil. So ends the matter, Watson, a photograph that smiled back, a chamber locked against reason, a dying note that pointed the way. All threads converge upon the oldest motives, envy, pride, and avarice. Yet I cannot help but reflect that the true terror of this case lay not in the crime itself, but in the power of suggestion. A smile once perverted was enough to unseat reason, to shake stout hearts, and to mask a murderer's design. It is well we struck the shadow before it struck again. I could not answer, for the truth of his words echoed within me. Even as the fire burned low, and the rain pattered against the panes, I seemed to see that twisted smile still, lingering like an after-image upon the air, a reminder that fear often begins not in fact, but in imagination, and that only Holmes's unerring reason had dispelled it. Holmes's words proved prophetic, for within a fortnight, Gerald Markham stood before the magistrate, his schemes laid bare in the full light of law. The evidence, though circumstantial in places, wove together with such precision that no room for doubt remained. The altered photograph, the witnesses who had seen him with the fatal parcel, the notes in his own hand, and at last the draft will that revealed his hidden motive. Markham, pale and unrepentant, maintained his silence to the end, though once, when Denham entered the court, a flicker of that same twisted smile crossed his lips, as though he still clung to the belief that terror was his true triumph. But the gavel fell, and the law claimed him, consigning his smile to memory alone. When the business was concluded, Denham visited Baker Street one last time. He carried with him the restored portrait, its gentle expression returned, and placed it upon Holmes's table with quiet reverence. "You have given me back not only justice," he said, "but my sister's face as it was. That is a gift no court could grant." His voice faltered, and for a moment he stood in silence, then bowed deeply and withdrew. Holmes regarded the portrait for a long while after Denham's departure, the lamplight glinting upon its surface. At last he turned to me with a half-smile of his own, weary but content. "You see, Watson, how trifles lead to truth. A faint alteration of a smile, imperceptible to most, contained within it the shadow of murder, inheritance, and long-nursed vengeance. It is ever so. The smallest detail unmasks the grandest deceit." He rose, drew his violin from its case, and with a sweep of the bow filled the room with a strain of music at once melancholy and serene. The fog pressed against the windows, the fire glowed low upon the hearth, and I, seated in my familiar chair, could not help but marvel once more at the singular genius of my companion. Thus ended the strange affair of the photograph that smiled back, leaving me with the abiding conviction that, where others saw shadows and superstition, Sherlock Holmes alone saw the clear light of reason, and in that light no crime, however cunning, could long remain concealed.